Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Sales Management Association. Our session will start momentarily. First, a few announcements. Please note that we will not open attendees' audio lines during the Q&A portion of our broadcast today, but we do welcome your questions and comments. We encourage you just to submit those at any time during the session. You can do that by typing them into the small chat window labeled questions on the right side of the webinar application. Your questions will come to me as moderator and I'll read them on your behalf. Also, as a reminder, our session today will be recorded and will be made available for playback in the Sales Management Association's resource library. Our members will also find copies of today's slides there. Today's session is one in a series of web-based Sales Management Association presentations that feature practitioners and thought leaders in the field of Salesforce effectiveness. The Sales Management Association is a professional association for sales operations and sales management professions. We provide our members with research, case studies, training, peer networking, and professional development. If you're joining us for the first time on this members-only session, we, as many of our invited guests are, we do invite you to consider becoming a full member of the association. You can learn more about that by going to our website. That's at salesmanagement.org. Also, please be on the lookout for our upcoming annual conference. That's October 23rd through October 25th this year at the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta. Be sure to join us for the 9th annual Salesforce Productivity Conference. You can learn about our conference on our conference dedicated site. That's salesmanagementconference.com. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. Today I'm going to share with you the results of recently concluded research, and I'm joined by a fine presenter, Robert Blome from Open Symmetry, that I'd like to welcome, and let me briefly introduce him now. Robert Blome is the Senior Vice President of Sales and Alliances at Open Symmetry. With over 15 years of experience in sales effectiveness, performance management, and technology, Rob has managed consulting projects for Fortune 100 companies across many industries. His focus at Open Symmetry is to drive the sales organization to reach the company's aggressive growth goals while remaining committed to client success. So Rob is no stranger to our audience. He's presented with us many times, and it's always great to have you with us. Rob Blome, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Thanks very much, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. So, as Bob mentioned, I'm with Open Symmetry, and my role over the years has been very much focused on sales performance management. And so, the opportunity to see the results, if you will, and share kind of thoughts and feedback on how we're interpreting this data, I think is going to be an interesting one. So, again, I appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Well, thanks again for being with us. So let me just remind our audience, many of whom I'm sure are familiar with these kinds of webinars, which are a little bit different than our typical webinar. In a research first look webinar, we basically lift the curtain on research that we've recently concluded. We've not yet written a report on this data, but we like to share it as soon as we have, coherent findings. We like to share it as soon as we can with our member audience. So that's the purpose of today's session. So my job is sort of play-by-play. I'm going to, in as straightforward a fashion as possible, discuss what we've learned from research in maybe 5 or 6 encapsulated kind of headlines. And I'm going to ask Rob to help us interpret those results. He's, if you will, our color commentator, and given his experience, he has great perspective to help us interpret these results and put them in practice. So let's get started. I want to just briefly introduce the topic, which is a topic on reporting. The topic addresses 2 elements of reporting on sales performance and also reporting on incentive compensation. So we're interested in this research because this is a pretty quickly evolving area. We know the role of technology has really changed things here. And we wanted to just take a moment and get a basic understanding of practices that exist among our members and a sense of what priorities and challenges exist, and also what are the things that are having the greatest impact. So we're pleased to have Open Symmetry help support this research. It was made possible, in fact, due to their underwriting in part. So Rob, I'm curious if maybe you can just share your own interest in this topic.
Yeah, no, happy to, Bob. So I think, our background at Open Symmetry is we've been around for about 15 years implementing these sales compensation solutions, and partnering with our clients to, in essence, ensure that they get the most value from them. Well, over the last 10 years or so, the vendors have been talking about advanced functionality around modeling, analytics, forecasting, and things like that. And so what we thought we could derive through this type of survey is to see how much of this capability or this functionality people are actually taking advantage of, right? And if they are taking advantage of it, what is the value back to the organization for doing so? So whether it is a third-party app or whether they're just creating that functionality on their own through homegrown systems, our interest was understanding, hey, is there something behind where the vendors are trying to take these platforms? Are they actually able to provide clients with value through this type of functionality? So this survey, if you will, was a chance for us to see if any of that is actually happening. And so I thought it was interesting to dig into this a bit and see if we could glean some of those findings, if you will. But for me, that's what was really kind of interesting for me on this one, Bob.
Cool. It's a good time maybe to mention that we'll have a follow-up to this survey, also focused on these sales performance management applications. And we'll continue to dive into this. This is really one of the central technology investments that sales organizations are making now in these SPM packages. So expect more to come. Here's just a little bit more information about the people who took our study. We had in total more than 100 respondents, 108 in total. As is often the case with our audience in these kinds of efforts, they skew heavily toward, I guess, larger firms. About 75% of the firms participating had annual revenues of at least 100 million US dollars. 10% had revenues in excess of 10 billion, and about a third were over 1 billion in annual revenues. The practitioners who themselves actually participated are chiefly in sales ops or sales effectiveness roles, more than half, in fact, 52%. The balance are spread across other management disciplines, including 10% in HR, and about a quarter are in various sales management roles. So let's get into the more substantive issues that we surfaced in the data. The first is really about just broad capabilities that organizations have in reporting. So we found that it's possible that accuracy may no longer be the biggest single challenge that organizations have in reporting. We found, though clearly there's ground to make up here, but 7 of 10 firms said that their reporting in this area is actually sufficiently accurate, but fewer actually said their efforts to distribute reports were sufficient. So while firms are getting reports right, they may not be as accomplished at getting them out. Now, this is important, we learned, because when we look at... Yes, Rob, go ahead.
Oh, if you flip back to that last screen, just one thing I wanted to offer up is, the two bottom items there, right? Timely and access by payees frequently enough. I absolutely would almost expect the kind of the results that we see on this page. The one thing that I would probably offer the listeners is the timely and access frequently by the payees. That often, I think, is, at least from my experience, it comes back to how often people are actually producing reports. I think historically people would try to produce reports when, pay went to payroll, right, as a way for payees to validate what they were looking at. I think now, they would say, hey, I'd like to produce them more frequently, but for whatever reason, for data availability and other factors, they're not able to get those reports out in a more frequent basis. I think the other area that we see is the access. The other kind of contributing factor to people accessing reports is rollout and adoption strategies. I've seen this for the last 15 years where people have really had challenges, rolling out reports and getting people to log in and look at the system and things like that. So I think that might be another contributing factor when we see, lower scores on those two, or I guess on that last one at the bottom. Bob, sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Just to reiterate the key point here, which is, fewer respondents in the survey believe that their reports are distributed in timely enough fashion. So now, what we know about that issue now, after running the data, is that it seems to be at least as important as accuracy. In fact, if you look at the firms that are doing a good job in these various areas, including distribution effectiveness of reports, their results correlate with improved sales productivity to the same degree that firms with reporting accuracy enjoy those correlations. So in fact, based on just these 5 independent correlations of firms doing a good job in these 5 areas, what appears to be the most important, though only just marginally so, is the timeliness of these report distributions. So the first thing we really found in this research is that it's not enough to get the numbers right. You've got to get them out, and it has a significant impact, seemingly, on sales productivity. And by the way, not just overall productivity, but also the number of people who are achieving quota in the organization. The companies that are good at timely distribution of reporting have more salespeople at quota, and it's true of these other attributes as well. But what we're seeing here is that this is a broad-based impact, and might be a blind spot for management if they're not focused on this notion of report distribution. So Rob, let me get you back in, and maybe you can just kind of answer generally about why this is difficult.
Well, again, just looking at the data and thinking back to a lot of the engagements we've been involved in, whether a client is first stepping into an SPM solution or they've been on a homegrown platform or program for a while, I think a lot of folks have adopted the initial strategy of, hey, let's just get some basic reports out, right, and make sure that they're accurate. And we're going to tie them as much as we can to when payroll is pushed over to ADP or when payroll is produced. And I think the challenge is when companies take that approach and they don't think about, hey, where do they ultimately perhaps want to land, what their target state is, they get challenged in adopting newer capabilities, newer functionalities as it relates to providing better service to the sales organization, to sales management. And so, case in point, if you set up your system to manage sales compensation on once a month or once a pay period, you never really do have the opportunity to bring more data into the system and actually produce reports on a weekly basis, right? So if you're paying monthly, you may want to produce those reports weekly. Well, if you don't initially set that up, you don't have that option without a lot of heavy lifting. And so it just sort of goes back to, I think the challenge for most companies is, they're not really thinking far enough in the future or thinking about best practices when they initially set these programs up. And that's why I think it becomes an issue or a challenge, right, when you want to start adopting some better best practices, if you will.
Yeah, good, thank you. So we suspect there's another issue at play here, which has to do really with who's responsible. And we found this in our study that when it comes to sales performance reporting, it's very likely that sales operations or some equivalent support function directly supporting the sales role is responsible for that. But then if you look at incentive compensation reporting, that has a more, it's more varied in accountability. So it's more likely that a non-sales function will handle that. And, about a quarter of the time HR is doing that. 1 out of 5 times roughly finance is doing that. So this is important, but this is important because we think it represents the root cause of this issue, namely that pay data and performance data aren't often presented in ways that could be most helpful, in particular in ways that could help payees project their earnings based on performance. So you can see from this chart, fewer than half of our respondents provide earnings forecast data based on an opportunity pipeline, or even based on a sort of scenario that someone could enter in. And we think this is important because the data really say that it correlates with improved productivity and performance. In other words, the firms that are doing this, the ones that are providing these pipeline-based forecasts or forecasted earnings based on transactions or a scenario, they outperform the firms that aren't doing it by 8% in the case of pipeline-based and transaction-based earnings projections. And similarly, we also see expanded distributions of performance. So the net here is that you can show salespeople their future earnings based on performance. The companies that are doing that are enjoying more success overall, and they're having more salespeople reach quota. So I'm curious about your thoughts here, Rob. Oh, I do have some highlighting here of these various things that call out the advantages that accrue to these companies that are getting this right. These are significant advantages.
Yeah, I would actually say, yeah, Bob, if you can bounce back up to 2 slides prior.
2 slides.
2 slides, yes, sir. So this one actually I thought was interesting, just to spend a little bit of, if you want, some color commentary on. What we've found historically is that, this type of capability, or I guess this sort of micro modeling at the sales rep level, the ability to kind of vet out what they might earn if they were to close certain portions of their pipeline. This capability has been, available, if you will, in the third-party applications for a couple of years, or for a few years now. I guess it's been 3 or 5 years now they've been kind of offering this. But when we talk about, the question, right? That question you've got 2 slides down. How are people actually integrating these kind of components, Bob? I think, to make what you see on this slide work, and or just to integrate these systems, it all goes back to kind of my earlier comment about defining that future state, right? Because if you don't spend some time understanding how you want to integrate incentive compensation, performance management data, and hopefully provide, your end users with the information they need to make decisions and be better sales managers or vice presidents of sales, it can be really tough to integrate or adopt later, right? So what we're seeing is a little bit more thought that goes into putting these types of solutions, or I guess these types of business requirements, in front of, any activity to deploy these applications. And or the other route we've actually seen people use when, the functionality is not there, or not readily available, if you will, is adopting other BI platforms and bringing those platforms in and creating, another level of analysis within their organization. So, I think, there's obviously all kinds of ways to improve and get better at this, but in some ways it goes back to kind of sitting down and creating that BI strategy for the different user roles you've got in your organization.
Yeah. So, in your experience, do you find salespeople doing this math anyway, whether or not the company makes it easier? I mean, you kind of want them to, right?
Well, you do, right? I mean, that's the whole idea for a sales compensation program, is to show them what they could earn if they execute on a certain behavior. And a lot of the vendors will attribute a high percentage of time by the sales reps to shadow accounting, right? Trying to figure out what they got paid or what they could get paid if they closed certain deals. Where we've seen, it implemented, we've gotten very positive results or anecdotal comments back from the sales organization, right? So when they have the opportunity to create that micro modeling at the sales rep level, they are seeing people more engaged, looking at their reports more frequently, looking at the data, trying to figure out how they can get to that next level, that next tier, or across that gate, or whatever it might look like. But yeah, I mean, I would say that where it is deployed, people are very positive about it. But it is something that I think it was surprising, right, to see as many people adopt it as you had, because when we talk with a lot of clients, they haven't gotten to it, but those that have are definitely seeing some benefits.
Well, your perspective is interesting there, that in fact the number is higher than you expected.
It is, and I was actually a little shocked to see that many people using that type of capability. But who am I, right?
Well, you're someone who sees a lot of these things, and I just also call out the interesting fact you relayed there, that companies should do this because you want people to understand the impact of the pay plan, but it's not just about reporting intelligence, it's about productivity, because they're going to do it anyway. You might as well make it easy for them. They can go on to use the time they'd spend in this shadow accounting that you talked about to do more productive things. So let's talk about our next area, which is about just all the things that firms attempt to do with their reporting and how effective they are. And so let's start with, their aspirations in reporting. And I thought it would be fun to do a poll here. So I'm going to do my best webinar engineering and bring up a poll. We'll launch this to the audience. The poll asks the following question. Which factors are most important to your organization's efforts to report on sales performance and incentive comp? We're going to allow you to pick 2 of these. So pick 2 that represent the most important of these 5. I always like to point out here that a fancier professional association would have some catchy music that would play right now.
Does that mean you're not going to serenade us?
No, I'm not. I'll be honest, though, I am humming that Jeopardy music silently to myself. But I do that all day long, so it's really not anything different. All right, our audience has mostly voted, so I'm going to close down the poll and show the results. Remember, everybody voted twice. What we're seeing here are the things considered most important by our audience. Is that displaying? Yeah, it should be. You see that, right?
Yep. No, I see it, Bob. I see the poll results.
Yeah. So the leading thing considered most important is easy to understand design, and that's more than 50% of our audience. And that's followed by drill through detail. Reports customizable by a user aren't considered as important in relation to these other things anyway. And then the other elements are what if scenario modeling and self-service access. So we thought this would be interesting because we can compare it to the results we found in the study itself. And let's get to those now. Let me hide our results. So these are the attributes that we asked our survey respondents to rate in terms of their importance. And just like our webinar audience, you can see that an easy to understand design in reporting was considered the most important thing. They also selected drill through detail. Of the 5 that we presented here, we drill through detail was the second most from our audience. And then the audience said self-service access was the third most. And they seem to be mapping pretty consistently. Keep in mind the question format was a little bit different in our actual research. But anyway, the point of this question and what we learned was that reporting efforts attempt to do a lot of different things. Really all of these things are considered important by at least half of firms. So what we also learned was how effective firms are at these various things. And I guess the short answer is not very. I mean, there's really only one thing that more than half of our respondents considered themselves effective at doing, and that's providing easy to understand design. But in the case of all these other elements, less than half of firms believe that they are effective. So this represents quite a gap in execution. Rob, were you surprised at these results?
Yes and no. For me, it was interesting to see that people didn't feel more confident about how they're executing, the different types of reporting, kind of effectiveness or the things that they're doing around reports. For me, it's always interesting to be seeing this type of data and then comparing it with what we're seeing in the market from a standpoint of vendor capabilities and how these guys out in the market are pitching their applications. It would almost seem to me, based on demos and where these guys typically emphasize their capabilities and their functional, their wares, is they'll spend more time, right, talking about that what if scenario, the mobile devices, customizer by user, the stuff at the bottom of our chart. And I think in a little bit, they're probably taking for granted that everybody is going to assume that, hey, if you're on our application, it's going to be easy to understand. You're going to have drill through capability. There's some level of self-service. So, I know this survey, and for those on the phone, listening, we didn't particularly ask, hey, are you using a third-party application or are you not? What we were really interested in, just see how effective they are. And so we aren't able to call out where people are more effective if they're using one of these third-party applications. But it was kind of interesting, right, to see that people aren't feeling super confident across the board, and way less confident on that on those last 3.
Well, you might have already answered this next kind of canned question that I had for you about why firms are so limited in their effectiveness, and is it because of the limitations of the technology that they're using? I wouldn't.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's usually not the limitations of the technology, right? Unless you're really sort of, you've not invested anything more than Excel spreadsheets and sending out reports on email or something like that. Usually what compromises reporting is, a narrow scope of requirements when you first install, right? So really not, as I said earlier, thinking about what your target state needs to look like. But where I've seen this oftentimes be compromised, or reporting solutions be compromised, is over the course of the life of a software package or a program. Oftentimes people are focused more on the compensation plan design, right? Making sure the components are correct, making sure that they're paying accurately and things like that. And as those things start to evolve and change, what people sometimes forget to do is keep the reports up. And so what happens is, you've got kind of that domino effect of, you're supposed to, do your new plans for the new year, and then you got to go back in and look at your analytics, your data draws, your reports to make sure they're all up to speed and reflecting the right things. And so if you're not doing that, if you're not putting equal amount of effort into, creating that level of transparency on what's going on in the sales program, oftentimes, and just anecdotally, we've seen the reporting and analytics solutions erode over time. And that's whether you're homegrown or on a third-party application. It seems to be, the #1 issue for folks out there with getting good reports, good analytics up, is just having that owner and be responsible for making sure that happens. And I would say, Bob, we talked a little bit about who owns sales performance, sales incentive compensation. From an earlier survey, we did find that when sales reporting and sales performance is owned by sales or sales operations or someone more closely affiliated with sales, you tend to have better service. And I think that kind of speaks to the idea that, they're probably have a closer ear to what the sales organization needs to see on a more frequent basis. But anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying I think, these systems sort of degrade over time if you don't pay attention to them.
I got it. I mean, there's so much happening in reporting, so many objectives to satisfy that I do think it's possible, especially after listening to you describe how companies often approach priorities, that companies just might undervalue certain things. We did try to get at this question. We, in fact, looked at all these various factors that are often present in reporting, and the good news is we found that overall, companies that are getting these things right do, they have better results than companies that are not. So these things, if done well, they do correlate with higher levels of success. Let's just see what that looks like. What's interesting, I think, here is the way that this data might slightly reprioritize what's most important in these reports. So let me first explain what we're seeing on the chart. The bars represent the incremental overall company sales productivity that is present in firms that are good at these things. That is, firms effective in providing drill-through detail in their reporting have sales objective achievement as a firm 22% greater than firms that don't do that. The second most impactful area was providing self-service, on-demand access, and mobile device access. So interestingly, the easy-to-understand design, which I think is rated most important, perhaps because it's maybe considered kind of table stakes, doesn't, at least in this analysis, yield the highest correlated improvement in sales performance. We looked at this a slightly different way. In addition, I'll display this chart again on the next slide, along with another chart that shows the difference in the percentage of salespeople achieving quota. And so what we see, for example, with drill-through detail, that it correlates with an overall advantage of 22% sales productivity, but it also includes 17% more of the sales organization achieve quota in those firms that allow or provide effectively drill-through detail. Similarly, the self-service on-demand access yields 21% overall improvement, and 10% more of the sales organization achieves quota. So we're doing these calculations independently, so I wouldn't put too much stock in how these things might directly cause improved sales results, but it's interesting, especially when you look at easy to understand design, that it doesn't necessarily mean that more salespeople will be effective. In fact, salespeople, I think, want the substance of the data. The results that we see here seem to indicate that salespeople are more focused on getting the data and getting a robust look at performance than they are in design that's super easy to understand. So do you think, Rob, I just wanted to diverge from my canned question, do you think these represent some blind spots for managers, and if so, how? Now's the time to talk about, what these findings might be telling us about what management should be paying more attention to.
Yeah, so before we get into the questions on the slide, when I looked at the slide prior, right, those two charts that you had side by side, I think, when you see the drill through capability, self-service, what if modeling. These are all I would consider higher level attributes, right, of a higher performing sales compensation or sales performance or sales operations team. And that may lead to just a natural follow through of, more attention to the sales force, better information, more self-service across different aspects of their jobs. And so then that's going to naturally lead to higher performing capabilities. So again, when I see those specific attributes, those are all, kind of what you would expect to see from some of the better systems in the market or some of the higher performing programs. And so when we talk a little bit about underestimating the advantages of high quality reporting, I don't think, from my experience, a competent sales compensation professional at all underestimates the value of good reporting, right? They understand, hey, what are incentive compensation plans supposed to do, and what behavior are they supposed to drive? For me, it seems to be broken into two kind of buckets, right? And I know generalizations aren't always good, but this is probably the easiest way to make this kind of message or provide this message. In one school of thought, you have organizations that look at sales compensation as a cost of doing business. Those groups oftentimes will look at sales comp and sales performance as, hey, we got to make sure it's accurate. We got to give them some sort of compensation statement. Now we're done, right? They've been paid. They know what they've been paid. Moving on. The other school of thought that companies are, I think, more and more adopting is seeing sales performance management programs as an opportunity to drive revenue, as an opportunity to drive sales performance at the rep level, right? This whole concept of providing drill through capabilities, what if modeling, higher levels of analytics, these are all attributes of companies that don't see sales comp as, cost of business, but really do see it as an opportunity to grow. And so when you ask that question, right, do we underestimate the advantages of quality reporting? I don't think most people that are close to sales compensation would. I think it kind of has to rise up to a higher level within the organization and shift the paradigm from, yeah, we see this as a cost of doing business, to more of, hey, it's an opportunity for growth. And until you make that paradigm shift, I don't think you're going to be taking time to look at, what could reports or analytics do for our organization. So I mean, it's just, again, it's sort of an obtuse observation, but that's kind of how I would tie this together.
Well, I don't think it's obtuse at all. I think it's astute. I think that companies see this maybe in these capabilities, and they don't see a potential return. I'm hopeful that this data suggests there's ROI on these capabilities. And not only that, you should be afraid, because companies that are doing a nice job with this are separating themselves from companies that aren't investing in these capabilities for sales organizations. So, that separation should only widen as, what these data are telling us is correct, that these are really important capabilities to provide. So, yeah, it seems like they're quite very much worth it based on what we're finding. So,
yeah, for sure.
Let's move along. Before we do, I'll just remind the audience we're happy to take some questions. We'd really welcome your questions, and you can just send them to me, and then I'll pick out the hard ones and have Rob respond to those, and then I'll take the really good ones. Anyway, the next thing we looked at was what I like to call reporting on reporting. This is important. You think about reporting as, we've been dressing it up so far as a very strategic capability. So how do you know if you're doing a good job on reporting? Well, what you need is reporting on reporting. You like what I'm doing with this concept, Rob?
Oh yeah, it's clever.
I can tell you do. Reporting on reporting. Let me just stay with me with this, because there's some pretty interesting things that come out of these, and some of these conclusions are among the more practical kind of ideas that you might take from this research. But one thing we asked was, and I'll just kind of display everything about this question at once as opposed to building it. We asked what was important to organizations who need data on how well they're reporting and how well they're executing in that. So we found that firms need a lot of input. They need most important is input on payout accuracy. You need to know what the actual number should be if you're trying to estimate how well you're reporting them. Data on payout timeliness, etc. In fact, everything that we asked about was considered an important input by at least 2/3 of the companies. The areas where companies are underperforming the most in terms of getting good data are in sales territory or other assignment schemes and ways of measuring potential for sales people. Interestingly, they're not getting good data on salesperson conduct risk. And we only ask about this because of the insight that OpenSymmetry gave us in this area. So maybe you can talk more about this, Rob. But just to sort of sum up what we learned here, that firms are looking for a lot of data on their reporting quality, but the effectiveness in getting that data and being able to apply it is quite mixed. Actually, Rob, before I invite your comment, I'll present this, which is really the same data. It's presented in a slightly different format. It's presented in a scatter plot. So the x-axis is importance, and the y-axis is how effective firms are. Now, we forced the midpoints of these axes to the mean value in each dimension. So this is a way of forcing the relationships between these things into these 4 quadrants. And those in the bottom right, you might consider to be the most important improvement priorities. So the things in that quadrant are among the most important things and among the least effective that companies are dealing with. And in that bucket are data on incentive payouts versus budgeted payouts, data on the distribution of quota achievement, and then this notion of salesperson conduct risk. And I found this most interesting. I'm eager for your insight in it as well, Rob. So I'm going to have you comment before we go on to these other slides.
Sure. No, I think it's it's sort of all aligning with where we see a lot of the conversations today, right? So some of the things that I think people find important, right? Conduct risk, quota distributions, incentive to payout. These are all things that I believe organizations are trying to ask themselves or ask the people that manage the data around sales compensation, and people are struggling. They're struggling to provide real content back and to say, hey, yeah, no, we've got this attributed to, or here's our quota distributions at mid-year, so here's how we can change our quotas to effectively get more out of the reps, or hopefully stave off any issues of people leaving the firm. So when you sit down and you start looking at your sales compensation program and you start putting the focus on the reports and analytics, these are things that people are trying to figure out. And so I think the vendors are responding fairly nicely to these asks. But oftentimes people start with the table stakes and don't get to this. So picking the right vendor or adopting the right technology that will support these, because it's an afterthought in some cases, it makes it all that much harder to obtain later. But yeah, I think if Bob, if we sat down with any of the vendors now, they would absolutely want to talk to you about how they've developed solutions to address these issues.
Yeah, they're really interesting. Let's look at the correlations we found in performance among the firms that are effective in getting this information. We found that there are basically 6 of these inputs that correlate with both overall improved performance and a broader distribution of performance by salespeople. And all this data will be in the full report, but I'll just call out a few things that are interesting. Again, we see the importance of let's see, Yeah, I'm afraid we have the wrong slide here, so I'll just talk to this slide. What we found was that the highest correlations with improved performance are for the firms that can accurately measure incentive payout versus budget. They were 26% more productive as companies, and they had 27% more of the sales organization achieving quota. Also of interest, I'll call out one more, salesperson conduct risk. The companies that can accurately report on risky conduct by salespeople, they're 8% more effective overall, but their salespeople, they have 21% more of the sales organization achieving quota. And those were two of the more remarkable elements that we found. So anyway, I thought that was most interesting. So let's jump ahead to a question I'll have you address, Rob, really, which might represent something a lot of our listeners are thinking about, which is where do you get started? Let's say you've been a firm that's always seen this as a cost center, and now you want to make your reporting capabilities strategic and also in line with those really high-performing firms. What are some good places to get started?
Yeah, I think, Bob, often kind of our answer on this one is through an assessment, right? And whether this is an assessment that you complete on your own or you bring a third party group like us in, the idea is really to take stock of how well you are performing across all these different metrics. So to the point where and just for context, all those questions we've been asking and trying to get answers from are all things that we're trying to help clients think about, right? So if you were to take that, some of these lists and these questions on reporting capabilities and effectiveness and actually apply them to how well you're performing as an organization, you can quickly understand where you have deficits, where you have gaps, where you might not be considered a best practice. Now, while it's great to understand where you're at, you can use that same content to start to outline where you want to be, right? Kind of identifying that target state. And so if you spend some cycles self-evaluating your organization, understanding what all the different users need to consume from a sales performance or sales incentive compensation standpoint, you can start to see a future state, right, of where you ultimately want to start to perform at from a sales compensation standpoint. And then that will obviously, or not obviously, but that will hopefully start allowing you to start adopting more and more best practices and start migrating towards a best of breed organization. But as far as where do you begin, it's the answer is it depends. It really it does take a little bit of time to understand where you're at today, and then start mapping out that future play.
Yeah, I mean, those efforts obviously aren't without investment and at least time, but I think our findings suggest that it's worth it, and I hope companies take your advice. Say, I thought it would be good to take a few questions from the audience, and again, I'll remind our folks to submit your questions, and that we'll get to as many of them as we can. We have a couple in the queue already. The first question is, one of the previous slides referenced scenario-based earnings calculators. Can you give me an example of that? And Rob, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, sure. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, what some of these scenarios might look like is, say the sales rep logs in, right, to the portal where they would access their CRM and they would access training and sales compensation or SPM content. In that scenario, the sales rep might go into their what if calculator, and what they can do is they can actually import their pipeline. What they can do, they can actually bring their pipeline over to their sales compensation window, and they can tick which orders or which deals they think they're going to close by such and such date. Now, if the system's set up correctly, they can hit a calculate button, and what will happen is they can now see exactly what they're going to be paid if they close those deals. And what it does is it takes into account tiers and uplifts and things like that. But that's the idea behind that what if calculation, is to show the salesperson, hey, if you close this deal, this is what you're going to be paid. The idea there is that you're creating some incentive to get that deal closed, right? So, you know, if it's, like I said, if it's done right, if it's set up correctly, you know, they have the ability to go and cherry pick deals and figure out how much they might get paid, you know, if they can get those deals closed. So hopefully that answered or helped answer the question.
Yeah, good. We'll invite the questioner to follow up in case that's not the case. So here's a question that I'll definitely give to you because I do think it's hard. And the question is the question is, as it relates to sales performance reporting, is there consensus around being reasonably right and reasonably timely? And is it you know, is it better to be exactly right and untimely, or vice versa? You know, how do you balance those two things? Because I'm guessing now, I'm paraphrasing the question now, but I'm guessing in some cases those are kind of opposing objectives.
Well, I mean, yeah, so I think you have to be exactly right when you're showing someone their comp statement, right? When you're showing them what the value or the commission is per deal, they need to know, hey, if I'm getting paid on this information, or if this information correlates to what I'm getting paid, it's got to be dead on, right? You don't want to create the confusion or the doubt in the sales rep's mind as to that the data might not be right, because then all of a sudden everything's fallible and you're back to square one with the guys not trusting anything. So I would say probably accuracy is more important. However, I caveat that with, if you're producing more timely reports, right? Like if you're running reports on a weekly basis, you know, you may not have to tie sales compensation data or incentive payments to those weekly runs. You want to just capture the report, the orders, the deals, the details, customer information, things like that. And that way, you know, if it's not accurate, obviously the rep can go in and see, oh, hey, this isn't right, or I need to lodge a dispute, or I need to send an email to my manager to make sure I got, you know, accessed on that deal or credited for that deal. So I would say hey, if we're aligning payment information, you got to be dead on. And, you know, I'd rather be a week late and be dead on than a week early and be missing it. But, you know, maybe there's a little bit more latitude if you're not tying sales comp data to the reports, but you're just trying to get information in front of the reps so they can better manage, you know, their discussions with their managers and make sure that they're getting the right credits where they should. So, you know, the consultative answer is it depends, but that would be probably my first pass at it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And so, you know, this is why professionals in sales ops make the medium bucks, right? They have to sort through these ideas. So thank you for your guidance, Rob Blum. I'm sad to say that we're out of time, so I'll drop the questions at this point. But I would like to thank you not only for sharing your insight with us today, but also for supporting this research with the underwriting support that you provide the Sales Management Association. So thank you on all fronts, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody for your time. I appreciate it.
And I guess before we sign off, I'll just remind our audience that we do have another webinar coming up next week on Tuesday, September 17th. On that date, we'll present a similar presentation, first look at research findings on a CRM study we've done, really fascinating data. It's called Unlocking CRM's Value. I hope you can join us for that. You can learn about the session and many other sessions on our website at salesmanagement.org. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. Thanks again for your time and attention today. Goodbye until next time.